So, so Bart, it's such a pleasure to meet you after so long time. I'm really happy to see you. You have to tell me where, when, and where have we last met?
I think we ran into each other very briefly. I know I have. It is on the airport of Münster Osnabrück.
Mm-hmm.
And that was in, I believe, 2007.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason, I don't know why you were at the airport, but I was at the airport coming back from, I don't know where, flying in from München and then to the airport because it's close. Yeah, it's effectively the airport closest by where I live. So this is clearly well before the pandemic and well before anything else. And when there was a lot of traveling from my end.
What have you done in Münster before?
So we started to meet, and that was when we got really to know each other. I think it was 92. I was preparing to do a dissertation on, so remember this is 92, on data protection and security of data. Yeah. And so at the time, so I was working in Nijmegen University. I wanted to broaden and want to do a law comparison between German and Dutch law. And so the best way to do it, that was my thinking at least at the time, was why not study German law? Because that's the way to really get used to it. And we did have a library in Nijmegen, of course, because it's an academic library. And so we had the journal, I don't know if it still exists, Computerrecht.
Yeah.
And I saw some articles from your hand in that journal. So I talked to my professor and I said, yeah, why not contact Thomas Hearn? Because I think you were one of the few who was teaching computer law at the time, close by, because at the time already lived in close to the German border. And this is how we got acquainted, and when we really got to know each other, and how I got involved in Münster, in German law, and in trying to grasp it. And I think I was a bit overstretched at the time, but it was quite an experience, I can tell you. Very still fond memories of it. So that's the way how it I got involved in Münster and got to know you.
Yeah. And why computer law? Where is your fascinating point in history, in your personal history, to think in categories of computer law?
That's one of the things, and maybe you recall, I'm both a lawyer by education and an anthropologist. And so I started to look in combining work. And originally, I was very interested in trust in financial systems. And once you start thinking about it, and due to, say, at the time, so we talk about early 90s or 1990, so I had to find a job. And because you do stuff at these different layers, if you start combining studies, I ran into this. I ran into the position at the time that was researcher at the Nijmegen University, and that was all. Yeah, it had to do, and it was just starting with computer law, and especially with privacy protection or privacy.
Yeah.
That was the around the first time that they were discussing the guideline, the first initial guideline, etc. So I started teaching privacy law. And from one comes the other. So I always kept looking for different areas of combination. And the nice thing about computer law is this is a real area where you see, it's not just law. It is also, it has this, I would say, a social component to it. It has a historic component to it, especially privacy law.
Yeah.
It has this economic component to it. And is this, yeah, as I said, because of combining, say, my education, you can combine it at different levels. You can always combine this in this very nice niche, I would say, of law. It's in computer. You can go anywhere you want. So, which I did at the end of the day. So my studies and at the university was in computer law, but then I moved into business. So that was my second major job, effectively. And that is when we lost track of each other.
What happened to your PhD?
I didn't finish it. I was on a limited contract for 4 years.
Yeah.
And so I didn't finish it. And I was, finding my way around. I did publish some articles on law comparison. But then I moved because the contract moved and I had small children. You need to earn money. But the good thing so it's not so much the PhD, but the computer law was interesting. So I ended up in 95 with the first commercial internet service providers in the Netherlands, and which was a huge thing at the time, because if you talk about fascinating times, 95, 96 is probably the most fascinating time for the internet. And again, that was another way of, as I said, combining the knowledge around computer law, privacy and everything else, contracts, but also say watching and observing the impact of the growing internet.
So you worked for Access for All, huh?
No, NLNet. NLNet was part of the EUNet conglomerate. And EUNet, and they, at the end of the day, it probably was the largest. And that got, say, at one point, some EUNets were got independent. And others merged and went to KPNQ West. I think that was but I can't recall precisely. Or they ended up in EUNet. So that was the American, and this was, I would say, end of the 90s. You saw these huge American companies moving into Europe, but also in Europe, the telecom operators finally figuring out, yes, the internet is the future.
How did you manage to understand technically all these difficult networks?
It's a very, depends on, and I think it's an interesting question, is I think at the end of the day, I really don't understand it. That's the bottom line. And what is very important is don't have the pretense to understand it. If you don't, you ask questions. And that's what we do. So that's where the lawyer education comes in. And the good thing of say having and I always working with small teams, is you have short lines. If you don't understand it, ask questions and go to people who really understand it. And they should be able to explain to you at a little bit more than a layman's level, what is important. So never, ever try to figure, you can try to figure it out yourself. You have to be interested. Look, that's the bottom line, of course. You need to be interested. You can't go in this, I would say, new environments without any interest in technology. So that's one. That's the real driving thing. But you don't have to understand how the various protocols work and what is included in a bit packet, or how a cryptographic algorithm works. So you don't have to be a scientist or a mathematician to do and get involved. At the same time, and that is what I found. And he's still a friend of mine. At the time, I worked very closely, and he was my teacher at the time on technical levels, with a researcher. He came from Carnegie Mellon, and then he was, I think, employee number 14. I was number 15 at the time. So so we from the early batch. And the reason why we could communicate so well is, say, the way, if you look at drafting contracts, for example, or law, how it's developed, it is almost like writing a software program. And so the routines, you always refer to routines somewhere else, existing routines, you don't copy and paste. You know, there is a lot of background, like in a system and in an effectively system, and you focus on a specific area. And say, once we got this done, we had a kind of shared interpretation, how, say, for legal problems, and for issues he ran across when he had to deal and explain to others. So what we've found, and at the end of the day, yes, it is a complete different world, but at the same time, you have a shared way of structuring issues and problems, and that makes it easier as well.
Did you ever have the situation where you would say, I don't understand technology at all?
Yes, in when they really start, not at all. No, I don't think so. No, the reason is, when they asked me at the time, and still ask me, say, in this environment, it's always the issues that surface, and why I got involved, is they couldn't explain. It's not like having a conversation between technicians. That's a different.
But was there another situation, vice versa, where the technologies say we never understand lawyers?
Oh yes, they don't understand. They do. It depends a bit on their mood, I would say. It depends on their mood and how you deal with them. Is again, so you have to be open, I think, and frank and transparent about what you say. And then, like in every normal conversation, it's you need to be able to explain. And I don't know who I think it was one of my former bosses who always told me, say, and I think that was very wise, is that if you're not able to explain it to your wife or another partner, what you're dealing with and what the issue, then you probably don't understand the issue yourself. Then you make it too complicated. You haven't drilled down to the heart of the issue. And even for technicians, say, or mathematicians, I really like watching or reading about mathematics, not in terms of formulas, but some of them are very good in explaining why they do stuff the way they do stuff. And that is, and you need to be lucky to have one or two of these people around. But if you are, listen and you learn. And the other way around, you need to be able to explain it, the legal issues, from that perspective as well.
The reason why I'm asking so harshly is the next step in your career. Because I think it's fascinating to work for a Dutch operator and then have the big skip to ICANN. How did you manage to come to ICANN?
There is a step in between, and let me explain. It's like, say, the ISP, one of the things they have to deal with is domain names. And at the time, there was, and we're talking about the mid-90s, 96, 97. So the DNS and all the domain names, business and industry, was very limited. It was done in America by John Postel at the time, because he was still around, in IANA. At the time when I was at at the time, you could see already there was a lot of interest in domain names. say, especially from the commercial parties, and we from NLnet had to deal with it. So from this ISP, and I not directly, but they always asked domain names, and they had to go to this person. And because of the growth in the 95, 99 era, the 98 era, it outgrew this one person. So what happened, in the Netherlands, at least, there was a foundation created, SIDN. So that was, and they became, I would say, the manager of .nl. And I was involved first. I didn't know, but I was involved as say NLnet was the largest ISP in the Netherlands at the time, together with the academic network Surfnet. And so they were the main drivers for this foundation. And I was involved as being in-house counsel for NLnet at the time. So that's when I really started to look at the SIDN. At one point, and that was in 1999, SIDN started to look to, because it grew and it grew and it grew, I think, for people. So I became the first CEO of SIDN at the time.
Yeah.
So my route was from the ISP to the national, to the national CCTLD manager, like DENIC in Germany. So SIDN is comparable with DENIC, and then I stayed there for another 4 years. So working very closely with people from DENIC at the time. And then I moved to ICANN. So that is the route. So there is an intermediate step. You don't go from an ISP to ICANN, at least not in my case.
Yeah.
So and in that trajectory, so going from in-house counsel to be the CEO, this is where I lost, I would say, the link with law as well. Because you have a different perspective on, as a CEO or as general manager, however you want to call it, on the issues you had to deal with. So I still did say initially I did the first terms and conditions for .nl, but at the end I was talking about all different stuff about, for example, the commoditization of domain names. So that was in 2002, and this is the area of the initial .com bubble as well. So I had effectively, I've by luck, by chance, or whatsoever, I was fortunate to be in two of these really expanding areas of the internet. First, the infrastructure, and secondly, the domain name industry. And then I got involved in ICANN. So in 2004.
And for German listeners, they always have a feeling ICANN is a ghost. It's a small company situated in Santa Monica from a formal point.
Yeah.
But from an informal point, it's traveling agency, a very big traveling agency, traveling from Paraguay to Korea. So is there really an ICANN as organization, and who is working there?
It's initially, I think you don't. It depends on. So if you put on a legal view, there is this company called, and I think it's a not-for-profit by Californian law, and this has a certain meaning. So it's not like a not-for-profit in Europe, because not-for-profit doesn't exist, at least not in the Netherlands. It's either you're a foundation, you can make profit, but you don't share it. It's not for the owners. Or you have a for-profit company in the sense of you have limited liability or a whatsoever, and then whatever profit you make is shared among the shareholders. So that's a different way of looking at it. In the US, they do have a company that's called a not-for-profit, and it has a certain status. So, and it's always been there, and it was always, that's the legal view of the organization. If you think about it, and if you look at how ICANN came into existence, it's fascinating. At the time, it was, I believe, when it was started, and that was in 1999. And that was my first meeting as well. That was in the Adlon in Berlin.
Hey, schön.
That was very nice. I have to say, that was the first meeting ever for ICANN. But so they had four staff members, and they had 18 board members, 15 board members.
Yeah.
And all other attendees came from all across the world.
Wow.
And they did have an interest in ICANN, like DENIC. DENIC was at the time one of the co-organizers in 1999. SIDN participated. I was there with the chair of my board, and you had I think about 50 CCTLDs from all around the world attending that meeting, including, and this was an interesting meeting from that perspective, including the government representatives. So if you look at it from another perspective, from an organizational perspective, ICANN has always been broader, and it's always been built up from say all these different stakeholders meeting to discuss issues at these meetings. And effectively, you had the board taking decisions. Some of them are corporate, but some of them are really around policies around the DNS, for example, new GTLDs. Clearly, this is what I call a policy for DNS. And they always met, and it's always been this hybrid thing. It's always difficult to distinguish. And in that sense, it's very interesting to go back to the history of ICANN, I would say, and when it was created. This was, I would say, when they started talking about ICANN, yes, it had to be in California. It had to be not-for-profit because it took over a contract and everything else from IANA at the time, because IANA clearly predates ICANN. The IANA function. This is the core of DNS, and they had to encapsulate. And IANA was clearly in contract with the US government. So this goes back to why it was created at the time. So that's one thread of the history of ICANN and why it is as it is right now. Second one is probably more a political, sociological point of view. Is, if you recall, that the 90s, you saw this huge liberalization of the technology of, say, the infrastructure of the telecom sector and everything else. And one of at the time, it was called public-private participation or cooperation. In that sense, ICANN is clearly the result, and still is one of the few organizations where you can really see this public-private collaboration, participation to deal with one specific area. In that sense, and I still think of it as somebody. I'm quoting somebody. And that was from 2001, I believe, but I still think it's true. It's a social experiment. And so that makes it ambiguous and therefore very difficult to position. If you look at the organization right now, it has over 400 employees, most of them located in the US, because its remit and the interest on what it does has increased. But also with an office in Brussels, an office in Montevideo, an office in, I think, Nairobi, and definitely in Singapore. These are small offices, but this goes back to servicing and being in the same time zone as all these participants. And that makes it ambiguous. And at the same time, although it is important, the DNS, at the same time, it's a nice, in a way, it's a bit of a niche market, niche.
What do you think about the idea of Kleinwächter? I wonder whether he's still alive.
Yeah, he is.
Yeah, he has written several books and articles, and always told that ICANN is a new government of internet.
I think it is a view.
Mm.
It's ultimately it is, and it has to do with the social experiment.
Mm.
So what people do and I know Wolfgang Kleinwächter. We never had the discussion around it because he was in another area than I was. So it has it. The model has its failures. Don't get me wrong.
Mm.
At the same time, and maybe it is ultimately proves to be unstable. I don't know. Nobody knows. At the same time, calling it a government, you try to categorize it and put it in a certain known box where you lose some of the major, I would say, advantages of the model as is right now. Is because and I think one of the let me give you an example closely from where I am. One of the, I think, major and principal points of discussion is who gets a country code, who doesn't, which geographic area gets one. And I don't want to go into the details of the various issues, but in 90, I think in 80, no, it's 95 when it really got documented in RSE 1591, is there are two sentences in that document, which is really at the core of I would say the country code side of the DNS, is it states IANA is not in the business of determining what is and what is not a country. Now, imagine if you're a governmental organization, you get involved in to determine what is and what is not a country. You can see everybody jumping on that bandwagon because it does have a real impact on everybody's life, but also on the geographic or geopolitical relationships. Say, and the other one is, and just to complete it, at the time they've chosen for ISO 3166 as the standard for country codes, and the reason is I know they've looked into other potential areas as well. For example, number plates. Every country and territory has number plates, but they didn't do it because it was not consistent. The designers at the time, the real architects of the DNS. And the other one is ISO has a process to do so, to allocate the country codes. So with these two things is you do it externally, you're not involved in these huge geopolitical questions. And so that's probably my response to something like what Wolfgang said, is at the end of the day, it is really about identities and geopolitical things about it. So I was involved, and this say there is another reason why you don't want to do this, is I was involved at the time in the international domain names for CCTLDs, and we're talking about 2007, 2009, maybe 2006. And what was important is, although there was a process in place, everybody, all the various stakeholders groups agreed upon there we need to do something about IDN for certain countries because it was high on everybody's agenda. And so the policy itself, and that's with a small p, because it didn't follow the process, but people agreed upon a process up front, they ran it. So within 6 months, we had the policy. Imagine this would have been a governmental organization. That's one. The second thing is implementing the policy is another thing, because you need to, you need to have an entity, and that's the strength, I would say, from ICANN as well. Although people really complain about it, and it's getting harder and harder. But yeah, that happens. But at the time, starting with developing the policy, I know that was in November 2007, up to opening up, that was in November 2009. So when we had the first applicants, so that's a 2-year time frame from development to implementation.
Yeah.
Maybe there is a way, but I think and this is globally. It's not, say, in entirety. This is really globally. I can't see this happen in other areas. It's a little bit. I don't know if you are aware or if you've discussed this, the whole discussion around the transition. So the transition from the IANA stewardship from the USG to, I would say, the global multi-stakeholder model. That's another way of looking at it.
But don't you see, don't you understand the fear of many people that the ITU is taking over the whole business?
Oh yes. But I think you can do two. You have two ways of dealing with it. You can, and maybe I'm too naive or maybe too pragmatic. Is the proof is in the eating. Is you have to show what you're capable of. You have to and address the shortcomings, because there are shortcomings, absolutely, and be aware, but be open, transparent in what you do, and but that's difficult. It's very hard because it's such a another way of looking at it, I'll do it in a minute, is it's so hard to appreciate what is happening at ICANN that, say, it's very easy to criticize it. And if you don't have this background in what has been achieved over time and compare it to other situations, then it's easy. And the ITU, yes, it is. It again, going back to what Wolfgang said, I don't understand, and I haven't read his articles or his books, but I don't understand, and there will be a nuance or a difference, but I don't understand it a prima facie difference between his model and the ITU. Because you start already crossing a border where you empower it to a degree almost comparable to the ITU. And one of the criticisms I've seen and I've heard lately, and that was a very interesting observation from somebody from Europe, is one of the shortcomings of the model, I would say right now, is, if you recall, I talked about the public-private participation or the multi-stakeholder models. In some areas of this world, it doesn't mean a thing. And so they feel left out because there is no private industry powerful enough to attend and participate in this area. So that's a capacity thing in those countries and territories.
Let me ask you one thing. Do you think ICANN will live already in 50 years, or is ICANN dead in 50 years?
I really don't know. It's 50 years is... So the reason for at the end of... Let me go back and try to answer it from a certain perspective. Say one other angle I had about say I wanted to introduce on your previous question is somebody say, again I'm quoting, who said boring is good. It means if it's boring, nobody pays attention. It is a non-issue. and therefore if you start to get interested, because it's boring, you hardly know it. And say, what is happening? What is this about? But in that sense, boring is good. Say the danger of this, and I think in a way, if you look at the way, besides all the politics and everything around ICANN, it has proven to be a guardian and a steward of the DNS since it was created. There has never been an issue with the DNS over these years. Yeah, there have been some hiccups, but they've introduced it, DNSSEC, other stuff as well. And in that sense, it's really boring. But at the same time, once you control it, and this is a matter of control, it's in that sense, you're a victim of your own success.
Yeah, that's true.
So going back to the question, will it exist over 50 years? I think depends very much on to what extent other interests and geopolitical interests feel it's necessary to interfere, and are they willing, and to what extent? Because in that sense ICANN doesn't have the power, and it never wants that power. It's, at the end of the day, it's a technical organization. And as you know, and as people listening to us will know, that there are other powers that have another view of this world and want to use it to their own advantage. And to what extent that is balanced, I don't know. If you talk about, and that's one side of it, the second point or the third point is, will ICANN evolve into the next technology? I don't know, because that's the underlying issue as well. So will it, of your question, will ICANN always, or the next wave of technology, will it need something like ICANN with that same cloud? Probably it will need something like ICANN, because the technology will not go away, but it will not be the next major thing. It's a little bit like the copper lines and copper infrastructure. It will never go away. But does it attract attention? No. And so that's the next. So that's another point to take into that equation.
Listening to you, I'm very impressed. I'm really absolutely impressed, especially by your knowledge, understanding in technological matters. How can young law students get your skill? How do they learn to become, in 50 years perhaps, employee of ICANN?
I would say, first, stay close to home and try to learn and talk to technicians. That's, I think, what we discussed is at the start. And always be curious, and don't think you know it. Because let me give you an anecdote about ICANN, and that explains what I'm saying. ICANN is a complex organization. You got all these various stakeholders with all their own procedures, processes, different type of people, different type of interaction, etc. So we do have people coming in, new employees, but also new participants or observers. And after 3 or 4 months, they say, yes, I understand it. And this is when you have to become very, very suspicious, because nobody understands it. Going back to your question, if you think you understand it, I think you made the wrong choice, because you don't. So you have to stay curious. And in my case, I was in a way lucky. I didn't plan my career. As I said, when we started, so when we met, you and I met, I was in university pursuing an academic career. I ended up by luck, by chance, in the first commercial ISP. I didn't think about it. I did it. And in a way at great cost, not great cost. So I was still living in Frieseveen, which is close to the German border, but this ISP was located in Amsterdam. And so I commuted 3 days a week between Frieseveen, and that's you start to develop a very sensitive balance, whether you like it and enjoy the work or you don't. So I don't want your students to do this, but no, but say find a job you really enjoy and learn. That's what I've done. And at one point you will see, it doesn't work for me anymore, and don't be hesitant and change. But don't do it after 1 or 2 years, and don't do it for the money. That's important as well. It's do it because you like it, and you have to be curious, I think, at the end of the day. And I think that's how we met as well, because we're both curious. Yeah.
Perfect answer. And I thank you very much.